All right, welcome to stifle Pod for the week of January 29th. I'm your host, as always, Ben Weingard, assistant professor at Hillsdale College. Also, as an update, I got my second Pfizer dose of vaccine today, so we'll
You-
probably
You're
start glowing by the end of the week.
you're officially vaccinated then, huh?
We'll see what happens with the variants that are spreading.
Indeed. And I am your co-host, per usual, Bo Weingard, unemployed still from an undisclosed location in the Midwest.
Yes. I will note we're both somewhere undisclosed in the Midwest, but I'm the true
True.
Midwesterner.
I'm on the border of West Virginia, so I feel a kinship with Trump country.
that's that's fair. So today, what we're going to do, we'll go over some news nuggets, including just a little discussion about what's going on in the Republican Party, move on to Biden's executive orders, and then have a little discussion about the minimum wage and conclude by talking about the article of the week. And this week it's Ezra Klein's definitive case against the filibuster.
Yes.
So, in terms of the news nuggets, I guess before we get to what's happening in the Republican Party, I'll note that the Fed put out a statement and they're leaving interest rates near zero. The reason I note this is because it seems that Jerome H. Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, is quite favorable toward the idea of doing fiscal stimulus. So he actually said he was more concerned about a slowdown and about having too much slack in the economy than about interest rates or inflation increasing, and said, frankly, we'd welcome higher inflation. Um, so again, like if we were living in a pragmatic technocratic society, that would, I think, be a signal that a relatively large stimulus would be appropriate.
Yes.
And I'll also note that the economic data are quite bad. So the economy contracted by 3.5% over the last year. Or if you go from fourth quarter to fourth quarter, it was 2.5%, but
Right.
still quite bad.
Yes.
Jobless claims were at 847,000, which remains well above the pre-pandemic peak of about 700,000. So the economy is in pretty rough shape. We do need to get stimulus out pretty quickly if possible.
I was informed that Biden was going to shut down the virus, not the economy.
Mm. Yes, we'll see what happens with that. I mean, I
I
think we
think
can.
I think expectations though are that you will probably get a pretty healthy economic recovery, say in the next 6 months to a year. And that's one reason you don't seem to have the kind of gloom or catastrophizing that you say did in 2008, 9 or something. I mean, because in terms of contraction of the economy, this has been profoundly depressing. But I think because people understand the discrete nature of it and the causality, it's not as disconcerting to people. Now, that doesn't obviously help people who have lost their jobs or their businesses. And that's a shame. And we need to do something about that. But it is
Right.
interesting that you don't have the same kind of hysteria, legitimate hysteria, by the way, in the 2008 9, as you did in 2008 9.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is a real concern about this so-called K-shaped recovery, right? Where the super rich
Mhm.
become even more wealthy, and those with relatively low incomes become even more immiserated. So that's a real concern.
Right.
And of course, we need, a combination of monetary and fiscal policy to deal with that. So
I'm more concerned, by the way, and this is just something that I haven't read a lot about, but just thinking about this, just setting aside the economic numbers, what is going to show up in the data in, say, 5, 10 years from now when we look at having a year without normal socialization, especially for kids? I think about kids who haven't gone to school.
mhm.
Will this show up? I mean, they're not almost certainly not learning as effectively as they would inside the classroom, especially kids who probably less intelligent, less disciplined kids are facing greater consequences from this.
Yeah, also in school districts where they don't have the resources to make
Right.
the transition to online learning.
Right. And relatedly, and this is another news story, I suppose, is that it seems as though there's a lot of contentiousness with teacher unions and,
Yeah,
figuring out should you open up, and they don't want to open up still. And I actually think it's getting to the point where you're almost creating bipartisan consensus against teachers unions.
yeah, it does seem
People are
that
not
way.
happy with how the teachers unions are behaving.
No, they are not. So in other news nuggets, we're not going to get into the COVID response or the vaccination program in any kind of
No.
detail, but I will just say that both Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx gave interviews this week, reflecting on their year or so in the Trump White House dealing with coronavirus, and it seems from their interviews that it was about as bad as you thought it was. I feel especially sorry for Deborah Birx, who she was on the White House task force, so she was in the White House the entire time, trying to thread the needle between being accurate and in her public communications and kind of sucking up to Trump. And
Yes.
her reputation's maculated. The Biden administration's not using her, and I think she will probably always be somewhat stained in the
Yeah, I mean,
future when you hear that name.
stuck between Scylla and Charybdis there for sure. And I mean, I waver back and forth on how we should deal with people who were responsible adults in the room, but had inevitably to kowtow to Trump and sort of beclowned themselves publicly, inevitably,
Right.
probably in the good-natured attempt to do the right thing behind the scenes. And I think Burks is probably one of those figures. So it's
Yeah.
hard to know. I think in that case, that's probably a lot more defensible than other cases because you were dealing with a pandemic that was serious and immediate, and somebody had to be the adult in the room. And if that meant you had to, say these ridiculous things about Trump and how Trump's doing this or that and how he's the most knowledgeable person ever on the virus, how his appetite for information is voracious.
Right. He loves reading charts and graphs and figures.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we'll have plenty of time to reflect on the Trump response to the coronavirus, and
Yeah.
we'll have more insider accounts. But I find it telling that these two high-ranking figures, right? Because Fauci's the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He's been there since 1984, and they couldn't do interviews fast enough after Trump was gone. Like they both were clearly like, we want to defend what we were doing and let people know what it was like to be around the Trump administration during this period.
Right.
Just as a quick nugget, we were talking last week about the Biden executive order on fuel efficiency standards in vehicles and saying that it was mostly symbolic token because vehicles were moving in the direction of zero emissions. GM CEO Mary Barra said that they had an aspirational plan to go carbon neutral, GM the company, by 2040 and to have all tailpipe pollution eliminated by 2035, which tells you what direction the motor vehicle industry is moving here. I mean, that's
Yeah.
actually quite interesting. So then we get to what is perhaps more, well, not perhaps, more politically important, and that is during the week we had this point of order vote by Rand Paul, where in the vote that took place in the Senate was not on the impeachment or conviction, but rather, could you even constitutionally impeach and convict a president after they've left office?
Right.
The vote went down. It was 55-45 in favor, which means that Democrats got 5 Republicans on board with the idea that you could impeach and convict.
Right. And
Now,
those were the expected 5:
yeah,
Sass, Murkowski, Collins, Romney, and who was the other one?
Toomey.
Toomey. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So the usual suspects. Now, we'll note that I think the overwhelming consensus among constitutional scholars and historians is that you can, in fact, impeach and convict.
I think, to be
There's
fair, there's legitimate disagreement about it, but that probably the majority view is you can impeach a person after they have left office. And I
Okay.
think there are good argument. Dan McLaughlin at the National Review has made good arguments about this. I mean, one thing to consider is, suppose that you do something one day before your presidency ends. You do some heinous deed that's not illegal. Right. So you can't actually be tried for it after you get out of office. What's the remedy for that?
Right.
Well, it seems pretty straightforward that the remedy would be impeachment. And this the clearly comes from English law, in which you could impeach people after they were out. So it really gets into this textual debate, because one part of the Constitution doesn't say explicitly after they're out, and it sounds as though it's only talking about when they're in office. And so the textualists say, well, if they could have put it in there, right, if they met after. But I think most people agree that you probably can. That seems to be most experts contention. And clearly this is a case where it's just political, right?
Right. So I think that's what's important. Setting aside the legal niceties of the case, what it tells you is, if you can only get 5 Republicans to vote that it's legitimate to have this trial in the Senate and possibly convict, you're definitely not going to get 17 to convict. So we can say impeachment is officially dead, pretty much. I mean, they'll still go through with it. Now, interestingly, the Democratic Senator Tim Kaine said out loud, what maybe politically he should not have, but he said, we're not going to get a conviction, so maybe we should just move to do a censure.
Yes, and he was trying to work on a proposal with, I think, Susan Collins, that would bar Trump from holding office again. My guess is anything that bars him, you'll not be able to pass it.
Yes, I agree with that.
I think you might be able to get a censure with nothing attached to it, but anything that has teeth, I don't think you'll be able to pass it.
I think if the Democratic Party right now is being completely rational, you would move to just a straight censure.
I agree.
Because at least that way you get Republicans on the record and they can't weasel out of it, right? So on the impeachment, you can weasel out as a Republican and say, well, I don't actually think it's like what Trump did may have been wrong, but I don't actually think that you can impeach a president after
so you could
the fact.
make the technical procedural argument,
right, which is
but I think, though, I'm not sure that that's true. You know, McCarthy, for example, Andrew McCarthy at the National Review made the argument that this is actually rational from the Democrats' point of view to go through with an impeachment trial, because it maintains Trump as the face of the Republican Party. And however many low propensity voters Trump turns out that vote Republican, he turns out a heck of a lot of Democratic voters too. Furthermore, he's like this centripetal force that holds together the Democratic coalition in disgust. And so you don't have these kind of fissures opening up that otherwise would in the Democratic coalition. So
Yeah,
although it might
I
not
don't.
be.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with that because
So
right now the Democrats have a fairly bold legislative agenda that they want, and some of it need to pass, like specifically that deals with the pandemic. I don't think you're going to see fissures opening up in the Democratic Party over the next, 5-8 months or something.
so
While
the
you're
the question though is, if you're Schumer or Pelosi and you're just thinking this through Machiavellian,
Mhm.
like, which you are because you're a serious political player,
Yes.
um, do you want Trump as the face of the GOP? And here's where you especially want Trump as the face of the GOP. You want him in midterms as the face of the GOP, because it turns out if you look at presidential election, he gets these low propensity voters out.
Yes.
They don't come out as much for the midterms, but
Yes, that's correct.
but he does alienate enough people to turn out more Democrats. And this is what seems to be the case in the Georgia runoffs. Like, you did have larger turnout among Republicans than you normally would, but you had even larger Democratic turnout. And some of the Republicans who would come out to vote for Trump did not come out to vote for Perdue or Loeffler.
See, I think the Republican Party, regardless of what the Democrats do, is going to be Trumpy. And so you'll be able to use that in the midterms regardless. And I also tend to agree more with Klein that if you want to lose the 2022 midterms, the way you do it is not pass legislation, right? Get caught up in a impeachment trial that will create but like, well, not create, there's already polarization, but that will lead to immediate enmity in the Senate. And then any chance of bipartisan cooperation on these bills, although that's very low anyway, is gone.
So it's probably a complicated mix, right? So
Well, let
some
me just say, I disagree with McCarthy that this is what there's some strategy that Pelosi and Schumer have. I think Pelosi, like, she really just needs to play to the caucus in the House, and they voted to impeach almost immediately after January 6th, where I think they had a reasonable belief that Republicans might be willing to convict after they impeached in the House, right?
Yeah,
And
but
after they
if
did that,
you're
what are they supposed to do? Pelosi's supposed to just say, like, forget about it?
Yeah, so there are internal dynamics that might be leading to this too. I think people have to be thinking through the political calculus. Obviously, that's what they get paid to do. I'm not sure. I think you could see it both ways. I mean, I agree that Trump is going to have an influence on the Republican Party, obviously, regardless. But making senators go on the record and vote to acquit him after the Capitol riot, that's going to produce a lot of material for ads, right? And so I mean, I don't know what's better. I don't like it. Well, let's put it this way. Just from a normative perspective, I would prefer they impeach and convict, but that's not going to happen.
Correct.
Like, obviously.
That's right.
So given political reality, I would rather they not waste time with this. I would like a censure that has nothing else connected to it other than what Trump did was reprehensible, then move on.
Yeah,
If
I agree.
Republicans don't vote for it, fine, they don't. You have that on record and you can move forward.
I agree. And we have Kevin McCarthy met with Trump in Mar-a-Lago yesterday. Lindsey
Talking
Graham,
about the 2022.
right, and Lindsey Graham is on record. He said, "quote We cannot take the House and the Senate back without his help. That's just a fact. It probably is just a fact. That's
so
true.
This is the terrible situation Republicans are stuck in. Like, if you could get rid of Trump, if you could excise Trump without excising anything else from your body, you'd be doing a lot better, because I think he is net a drag, especially on midterms. The problem is, because he has enough fidelity, voters have enough fidelity toward him, you can't do that. you can't excise that tumor without cutting out a significant part of your healthy body, or slowly rotting body, as it were. So
Yes.
it appears that the Republicans are in a very tricky, unpleasant situation. It also appears as though McConnell took the temperature in the room and decided now is not the time to jettison Trump.
Yes, because he had made a few statements that led people to believe he might be favorable toward conviction. But as Dan Pfeiffer said on Pod Save, that's like it's the quintessential trial balloon, right? He's just throwing this comment out there. You have plausible deniability. He didn't deny it, but it was out there, and apparently it got shot down pretty quickly. Like the
It's
other,
what any astute political leader would
yeah,
have done. You
that's
throw
right.
this
That's right.
out, you don't contradict it, which he didn't.
Yep.
And then if things go the other way,
Which they did quite quickly.
right, it's not as if he said, I'm definitely voting
Oh
to
no,
impeach, right?
I agree. I think
yeah,
what McConnell did is, fine. I mean, yeah, that's exactly what I would expect him to do. Just see, does this idea have any popularity? Will people go along with
right,
it? Nope. Okay, fine.
right. I mean,
Um,
you saw quickly people, especially people who want to pick up the sort of populist vote, people such as Rubio, pretty quickly went against impeachment hard.
yes, Rubio said
Um,
impeachment was quote unquote stupid.
yeah, and it's too divisive. Cotton went against it on constitutional grounds. Lindsey Graham went against it strongly. Rand Paul, obviously. So yeah, it's the Republican sort of civil war is still brewing. It's
It
unclear.
is.
It's unclear what's going to come
But
of it.
a
But
good indication of the direction of the Republican Civil War is to look at the relative fates of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Liz Cheney in the House,
yes,
where it seems that Liz Cheney is besieged right now,
she
whereas
is.
Marjorie Taylor Greene not quite as much, right?
I think Marjorie Taylor Greene's political future is much dimmer than Liz Cheney's, though.
I I don't know.
Yeah, I
That
do. I don't think Marjorie Taylor Greene's going anywhere. I think the Republicans remember King from Iowa.
Yeah, I'd
Yeah,
like to
well,
see if that could happen again.
yeah, I think that will, and it's actually King was much less egregious than
Yes, he
Taylor
was,
Greene.
but it was also a few years ago.
King was like basically explicitly a demographic, like he had explicit demographic concerns, and
That's
that
right.
was enough to get him squashed. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a complete conspiracy mongering buffoon.
Yeah, she's like full QAnon. I mean, she really is.
Yeah, she's just, I mean, right. But yes, Liz Cheney, I mean, there were people in the immediate aftermath of her vote to impeach, there were people accusing her of, making a vote for political purposes, but it's pretty clear that that was not in her political
Yeah,
interest.
I wouldn't be shocked if she lost.
Oh,
Eh,
yeah, I wouldn't either. I mean,
yeah,
she's going to
and
run
same
in
thing for
2 years. She'll get primary
Representative.
for sure.
Yeah, and same thing with Adam Kinzinger of
Yes.
Illinois. He will as well. So
Yes.
something to keep our eyes on. I'm sure we'll be discussing this over the next couple of months. So we move on to another busy week of executive orders from Biden. And again, as with last week, and you can do the same, but I'll just, do the executive order and then say whether I think it's meh, good or bad. So we have an executive order to phase out private prisons at the federal level. Uh, Note that this doesn't affect very many individuals. So there are
Right.
only roughly 14,000 federal inmates in private prisons.
Mhm.
So this to me, I'm meh.
I am not well enough informed about the carceral effects of private prisons, so I don't have a strong view on it
Yeah,
either.
I don't think it has any. Now, according to the Obama administration, some of the private federal prisons, they had more security concerns with them. But
Mhm.
Yeah, other than that, I mean, it didn't get a lot of attention
Yeah,
probably because
probably
it's
for good reason.
right. Uh, uh, he also had an executive order on tribal consultation and strengthening nation to nation relationships, essentially communicating that the Biden administration would be more favorable to Indian Nation and would do a better job of taking input from the various tribes when formulating policy. To me, this is good. I mean, it's hard to see what the downside would be.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
So then we have the executive order to combat xenophobia against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders.
Yeah.
My view is on the substance, meh, but it's probably bad because there's no reason to do it. And it just indicates an embrace of this more kind of wokest culture war type stuff.
Right. I mean, it's as far as I can tell, there's nothing to this more than symbolic, more
Yeah.
than woke signaling.
Yeah, and it's unnecessary woke
Right.
signaling because there's not actually a problem in 2021 with xenophobia against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders.
No, not that I can.
Right. I mean, there are isolated cases,
There are
obviously.
isolated cases of everything, right?
Right, right. There's no the systematic issue here that needs to be
Right.
addressed. So more substantively, we have the executive order on ensuring the future is made in all of America by all of America's workers. This, I think, is a good executive order. It's a populist EO. The basically it sets stricter standards for the when the federal government is procuring goods and services that they're purchasing goods that were made in the United States. It also has the effect of or is intended to of shoring up more local supply chains and in case we had another pandemic or some national security concern. Unions were favorable to it. So the head of the AFL-CIO put out a statement that was laudatory. The economists have noted it's going to have minimal effect actually on
Right.
American jobs or the overall economy. But
Yes.
as a gesture, I think it's positive, and to the extent that it does protect some vulnerable supply chains, I think that's not a bad idea.
This is one of those EOs that I'd rather see Congress take care of. And you wish that Congress was a functional body so they could pass this kind of legislation. But as far
Yes.
as the content is concerned, there's a little bit of debate about it. Like the XL Keystone, it
Yeah.
seems there's a lot more uh the chorus of voices about this is disproportionate to the actual content,
Yes.
but I will agree with the content so far as it goes.
And it does demonstrate, I think, that the Biden administration is serious about moving forward with this economic populist buy America type agenda overall. I mean,
Right.
if we think about like if this were Trump doing this EO,
Mhm.
he would be getting praised. Like Tucker would have an entire segment about how fucking awesome Trump was.
Right. And at some point we can have, when we have a segment on one of these podcasts that allows for it, a conversation about the way that right-wing populism runs into problems because the left wing actually does the economic populism better.
Yeah, they
And
do.
so
Right,
what do
right.
you do? Because you're right. I mean, this is an indication that some of the populist message on trade, etc., has become mainstream. And there were always populists on the left, people such as Sherrod Brown, Bernie Sanders, etc., obviously.
Yep.
And Biden picked up some of that. And you can see he used the rhetoric a bit during the campaign when he would talk about being from Scranton and the working folk, etc.
Yep.
So yeah, you're right. This is something Tucker Carlson would be praising if his God hero Trump did it instead of Biden.
Yes. So then we have
Pauly should be applauding this. Maybe he approved. He may very well approve this. I mean, he did try to get
Well,
the.
Rubio made laudatory comments when Trump was moving toward a similar Buy America agenda toward the end of his administration. I don't know that he's made a comment about specifically about Biden's EO. I do know that he's attacking the economic oligarchs on Twitter, so that's good.
Yes.
The next executive action we had was the combating climate change. So this order, in addition to the climate change carbon emission standards, it also directed agencies to purchase American-made zero-emission vehicles in a quote effort to create union jobs as part of Biden's overall Buy America agenda. So to me, this is probably a good executive order. Again, it doesn't do that much concretely, but it also had to be done to fulfill our obligations under the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on anthropogenic global warming. Very few people who talk about it are.
Yeah, I am not either, obviously.
In general, I think you could find a centrist consensus. Now, this would be contradicted by people both on the right and the left, but in the center, it seems as though you have a large group of people who think that anthropogenic global warming has the potential to cause deleterious effects, but also that those effects are dramatically overstated by people on the left. And the language of climate catastrophe is not terrifically helpful and is often used to promote a more centralized economic agenda that tends to alienate some people on the right.
I think it's also used to expedite what is a slow moving transformation of the economy from the extractive industries to renewables, and that's going to happen regardless.
It is. Now the speed, the rapidity with which it happens matters, of course, because
and what we do for the industries that are getting phased out is also important.
Right, because obviously slower change means less dislocation.
Correct. Agreed.
You don't uproot people as much. And
that's
but
right.
yes, it's clearly the case that extractive industries are slowly on their way out regardless. And you can see what happens as you get this, like the XL Keystone. You get a lot of symbolic feather preening about these things, and then you get hyperbolic claims that Biden is killing 80,000 jobs. There's no evidence for that. So I wish people could just talk about the underlying merits instead of making exaggerated claims. Here it doesn't seem as though it's that consequential. It is if you're somebody who is favorable to the extractive industries. You can see why you would be a little bit disgruntled by this.
Yeah, agreed. And then we have what I think is an actually like quite stupendous executive action, and that is the EO reinforcing Medicaid and the ACA, including they're going to have a special enrollment period on the exchanges between February 15th and March 15th so that people can sign up and get Obamacare or get insurance through the Affordable Care Act. Also, re-examine policies that undermine protections for those with pre-existing conditions, and also check into what they can do about increasing the affordability of the Affordable Care Act and other healthcare programs.
Yes.
Hard for me to see the downside to that.
ACA is popular or reasonably popular at
especially
this point.
The Medicaid
especially
expansion.
Medicaid expansion. And the administration should be doing everything it can do to make it work better, not worse. And the last administration, I think, because it was associated with Obama, Trump disdained it for that very reason. And you can see, I think a number of people have made the comparison between healthcare on one side and immigration on the other. Republicans' healthcare is Democrats' immigration. They can't deal with the topic fairly because they object to everything, but they don't have anything concrete. They don't have their own plan. So they
Yes.
rail against the ACA, but they have no better alternative. And in fact, when they state their views, they end up being things that are in the ACA, right? Like Trump
Yes.
made this big claim about how you couldn't get booted for pre-existing
Right.
conditions,
Right.
which was already the law of the land.
Right. It's also similar in that Democrats, when they have power, undermine the existing immigration laws by
Yes,
not enforcing them. And when
right.
Republicans have power, or when the Trump administration was in power,
They,
they
yes,
deliberately didn't update the ACA like policies to make it
right.
easier for people to sign up, etc. So yeah, I agree with that. So to me, this is just it's relatively inconsequential, but it's good to devote attention to this law and make it easier for
Yeah, you
people
might as
to.
well make it better.
Yes. And then we had the memorandum expanding access to reproductive health care. This all really the effect of this is it revokes the so-called Mexico City policy. And
Yeah,
that's the kind of global gag rule that you can't fund foreign organizations that perform abortions or
right.
provide abortion counseling or referrals. Now, I saw a couple of takes that this demonstrates the extremism of the Biden administration.
Yeah.
This is just a return to the status quo prior to Trump, right?
Yeah, and I couldn't. I think so obviously it has symbolic importance because if
Correct. Yeah,
you're opposed to abortion, you don't like this.
absolutely.
I couldn't figure out, and maybe there's just not a lot to the concrete effects of this. I mean, is it very important that we allow this kind of funding? Are you hurt if you don't? Are you hurting other countries if you don't do it? I
Mhm.
didn't find a lot of good analysis on that, so I don't have a hot take here. I would
Yeah, I
say
don't either.
this is the unfortunate effect of sacred values in the public domain is that you can't have reasonable, and we'll see this when we talk about the trans and the military issue, you can't have reasonable conversations about some of these issues because, again, going back to what we've talked about before, they become condensed symbols in Rod Dreher's words, and then people just line up on the expected side of the battle.
Mhm. Yeah, that's right. Um, so yes, it sends a signal to the constituents and interest groups in the Democratic Party that we're going to take a different attitude
Right.
toward abortion.
You're favorable
And
to
it lets
choice.
the evangelicals know that they are no longer in power.
Right, and that they're losing on those issues. Yeah, they're losing on those issues. I sometimes, I mean, this is a separate conversation, but I do wonder if could you imagine like a Democratic coalition that went really moderate on the abortion issue and picked up some evangelicals? Is that like
You could imagine it if you didn't have if the Democratic elite didn't have the composition that they do.
right, right. I mean, yes, with things as they are, obviously you can't practically do it, but I wonder what effect it would if you just imagine like I got to create a monster. I'm Frankenstein, and I get to create a democratic monster, and I make it incredibly moderate on abortion, not pro illegalization, but pro very, very rare and also pro strict laws in states that want them.
Yeah. Well,
And
you'd
then
also
100% commitment to the Hyde Amendment and not doing EOs like this that are basically putting your finger in the eye of evangelicals.
yeah, when 70% plus of Southern white voters vote Republican, why would you do that though? But I just don't see the advantage to the Democratic Party of trying to
Yeah,
moderate
there
on.
there may very well not be an advantage. I
Right.
agree with that. Yeah.
So then we get to what the EO that probably got the most attention for the week, I'd say, and that is the Biden administration's reversal of the Trump administration's transgender military ban.
Yes.
Um, and the EO, the kind of key section, it said, therefore, it shall be the policy of the United States to ensure that all transgender individuals who wish to serve in the United States military and can meet the appropriate standards shall be able to do so openly and free from discrimination, and the military would pay for medical procedures.
Right. So first thing to be clear about, so that we're actually discussing the content of the EO, is that it really wasn't a transgender ban per se.
That's right.
It was a ban on transgendered individuals who had either had sex reassignment surgery, or who insisted on identifying with the other sex, right? Their non-biological
Yeah,
sex.
discordant from their
Right.
biological sex.
So
That's right.
it allowed people to serve openly as gendered individuals, so long as they didn't do that.
It
Now,
also grandfathered in
yes,
people who, so
right. It
somebody,
wasn't just booting people out.
that's right. So if you were open transgender and you were serving during the period where that was okay, the Trump, the final Trump order on this allowed you to continue to serve.
Right.
Uh, so I think a couple of things. First of all, we should note that the having open transgender service in the military is actually, it's quite popular. So if you
Yes.
look at Pew polling on it, 71% of adults are favorable.
Hmm.
And even on the polling, 43% of self-identified Republicans favor it, and then
Yes.
78% of independents, 88% of Democrats. To the extent that we have good polling of military personnel, they seem overall favorable. Some
Yes.
research that I found said about 66% were favorable.
Yeah.
And I'll also note that depending on how you count open transgender service, 18 to 19 nations allow open
Right.
transgender service in
Right.
the military, including Israel, Scandinavia, most of Western Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So most of the nations that we would consider quote unquote enlightened
Yeah.
democratic
Western
societies.
nations. Yeah.
Yeah.
The nations that we generally would praise as being open,
And
liberal societies.
I think it's also, just as a historical note, it's important that the Obama administration did not do this in a like a radical disruptive way, right?
Right.
So they were very concerned about doing this the right way. The Secretary of Defense under Obama, Ashton Carter, was clearly favorable toward it. And then they commissioned, the Department of Defense commissioned a study by the Rand Corporation to look into the topic. And I guess we don't need to get into all of the details, but the long and short of it is that the Rand Corporation study suggested that there would be minimal deleterious effects, including to military preparedness and operational readiness.
Right.
So the Obama administration, I think, pursued this in a prudent way.
Yes.
The Trump administration absolutely did not.
No,
Right.
not
So
per usual. You might know,
right.
Trump acted quite rashly here.
Yeah. So the way the Trump administration did this, Trump sent a tweet out on July 26th of 2017 that said, after consultation with my generals and military experts, I'm not allowing transgender individuals to serve.
Right. And it wasn't, so it was this couple of tweets that it was unclear exactly what the policy even was.
Right. They had no plan,
who were
actually.
the people yeah. So it's just, again, it's what happens when
But
you.
I just want to note one other thing on that, because there's the long history detailing the Trump administration's incompetence actually rolling this policy out. But one
Yes.
thing that is extremely important is that the service secretaries at the time were quite favorable toward open transgender service. And
Yes.
the highest ranking, most senior military officer in the United States, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joseph Dunford, after he became aware of this tweet, he sent some emails out, and one of them said, P.S. If somebody asks me, and they're going to, I'm going to state that I wasn't consulted on this. And in
Right.
fact, that is exactly what he did state when
Right.
he testified on the Committee on Armed Services in 2017. He
Right.
said, I'm favorable toward open transgender service, and no, nobody consulted with me.
I mean, I just broad, the view from the bird's eye view on this is
Yes.
transgender individuals are going to serve in the military
Yes.
openly. It's not, there's just no way you're going to stop that. I think the evidence is pretty strong, although, I mean, I'm open and we need more of it, that it's not going to cause major problems in the military. And most people view this as a human rights issue. That is to say, they think it's a right for people to be able to serve in the military if they want to. And people, even Republicans, even deeply conservative people, have this sacred view about, if you want to sacrifice for your country, that's noble, and we should allow you to the best of our ability.
Yeah, provided
And
that you meet the standards.
provided that you meet the standards. And
Yes.
so there costs here. There are, I mean, there
Yes.
are things that you have to figure out. How do you do showers, bathrooms, etc.? Are there, is there concern about higher incidences of sexual assault, etc.? Is there, transgenderism is associated with comorbidities. Do we have to worry about that? Should we screen better, etc.? There are lots of problems here, but
Yeah, a
my
lot. Yeah.
view on this changed upon reflecting on the reading the literature carefully. And this is, in no way is this like transgendered individuals in sports, where you're actually upsetting the competitive nature of women's sports. Like, that's
That's right.
something that's causing immediate and understandable harm. This is not.
Yes, agreed. And so I agree with you 100%. And I think, yes, there are issues that are going to come up. Some of them are going to be fraught, how to handle showers, the barracks. Um, but I think the best way to deal with that is to have narrowly tailored policies at the localist level possible,
Yes.
rather than to do a discriminatory ban. And I think that's also the opinion of the service chiefs. So, for example, when they had this armed service committee testifying before the Senate, the Marine Commandant Robert Neller at the time, like, he said, look, like, we know we have 27 open Marines. We pay attention to them. We monitor that situation. And that's
Mhm.
similar input that other high ranking military officials said. So it's not as if you just have this black box and we don't know what's happening. They track this very carefully, and there is a lot of localized knowledge. And I think the conservative response should be, I trust that these people can handle those issues better than I could with some blanket discriminatory
I
policy
think
that
if
wouldn't withstand scrutiny by a court, by the way.
Right. I mean, I think if you're, I think for a lot of conservatives who are opposed to this, the actual motivating belief is simply that trans ideology is mendacious
Yes.
through and through, that
Yes.
there's no such thing. You can't become a woman because you declare that you're a woman. And we as a society shouldn't indulge that fantasy, right? I think that's what they might think. As an individual, I would treat a person with respect and I would use the person's preferred pronouns, but I
Right.
don't want society to implement policies that seem to uh, uh, codify this idea that you can become a woman if you're not a biological woman. And
Mhm.
so a lot of the argument works from that. That's like the visceral cause of the argument that follows.
Yes.
And therefore, a lot of the argument that follows is bad. So I was looking
Yes.
for reasonable arguments against this, and I had trouble finding them.
Yes.
Now, it's not hard to find them when you're looking at arguments against transgendered individuals in women's sports. Very easy.
Yes. Yeah.
So on
Agreed.
this one, I think I think the conservatives who oppose it would be better off stating the more fundamental argument, and then we would just have to agree, I think, as a society right now, that they've lost that argument in general.
Yeah, and I don't think you don't. I don't think you should be allowed to discriminate against a at least quasi suspect class of people because you think that their ideology is mendacious and it's a, you know, I was going to say, and it's a lie, but
Okay, but you can see, okay, so I'm trying to think of this from a religious conservative's perspective. And so imagine that you think that this is a complete lie. Like, men can't become women, women don't have penises. And now you have this rule in which a person who's a biological male can serve with women in the army. And that just seems like a lie. It's codifying a lie into the legal framework of the United States. And not just into the legal framework, but into this very important institution, the military.
if you have let's say a biological male who identifies as a woman and feels like he or she is a woman and has sex reassignment surgery and wants to serve in the military, why is that a lie?
Well,
what's the lie?
The lie from the conservative.
Who cares what terminology we use? I don't know how that individual.
Do I get affirmative action if I identify as Black and have racial reassignment surgery?
No, but I don't think you should be barred from the military.
No, I understand that, but it's not.
We're not asking to give
to be clear. Wait, to be clear. Again, I think this is important. Look, the way Trump rolled out the ban was completely incompetent and unforgivably clumsy and stupid.
Not only that, but just one note there. This is a case where it was deliberately discriminatory. It was meant that way. The people who pushed that ban want to discriminate against transgendered people, regardless of what you or I think of the ideology.
But let's be clear about, you could serve openly as a transgendered individual under the Trump policy. You couldn't, if you identified with if you were a biological male, you couldn't serve with the women.
That's right, but that was after.
No, I know. I'm saying that let's forget the fact that
the way it was rolled out.
Trump wasn't motivated by a sincere concern here. He was obviously trying to give handouts to evangelicals. He was trying to
in an attempt to get border wall funding,
right, in a very clumsy and unforgivably disgraceful way. But what I'm saying is, I could see somebody argue that, okay, in the same way that you can't get affirmative action, even if you say, I identify as a Black man and you have racial reassignment surgery, people, and not only could you not get affirmative action, people would hate you. The left would hate you. They would be so angry with you and they would say you're a lie.
Oh, right? I agree with that, but
that's how religious conservatives.
I understand that, but in this case, people, the openly transgender servicemen and women are not attempting to gain some special privilege from that. They just want to serve.
I know, but you are serving in a different. You would be serving in the women's facilities, etc., with the women in the military, right?
Is that some special benefit that you're given?
No, I'm not saying it's a special benefit, but I'm saying it seems to, from the religious conservatives' point of view, it seems to embrace the lie in the same way that you're getting whatever treatment an African American person would get codifies the lie that you are African American if you identify as transracial. That's what I'm saying. So, like,
Yeah, I
say
understand that.
you became the president of the NAACP, right? I don't think there's a rule that you have to be black to be the president, but there's the assumption that you will be. Now, let's say that you are born with European, fundamentally, predominantly European ancestry. Say you identify as black, have race reassignment surgery a la Robert Downey Jr. in Tropic Thunder, and you become the president of the NAACP, or however, what is it, NACCP?
NAACP.
Yeah. NAACP, yeah.
Yes.
You do understand that leftists would be ripping you and calling you a liar, right?
Yes.
Okay, and
Yeah.
that's this. So I think there is this weird asymmetry, because when religious conservatives call this a lie, that's viewed as being a bigot. You're a bigot for thinking that. Whereas on the transracial one, the leftists would be enthusiastically denouncing you as a liar.
Well, look, my cards on the table. I'm 100% fine with transracialism if that's how somebody actually feels. But setting that to the side, I think it's a little bit different, because here we're talking about whether you should, setting the ideology to the side.
Right.
Should you be able to discriminate against a particular individual because he or she is open?
But I think the conservative argument would be, it's not discriminating. They can serve in the military. They just have to serve as their biological sex.
Right. So the argument would be, it is okay to tell a man who's had gender or sex reassignment surgery.
But here, just to be clear, you don't even need to have had the gender reassignment surgery.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's true. Yes.
So I think maybe I think I would treat people who have had full-blown gender reassignment surgery differently from those who haven't.
And also, so they did have, if you did that and you showed, I think it was like 36 months of stability, then you could, I mean, the way it was rolled out, the final
yes, was much less.
But what I would say is, okay, so the Obama administration does their due diligence. They put this policy in place. The Navy, the Marine Corps, the Army, they realize, oh, there are more unintended consequences than we thought. Some high-ranking military officials write up some reports, and they give this to the Secretary of Defense or the Joint Chief or whatever, and then the president says, this isn't going like we wanted it to. Maybe we should actually reinspect this policy.
Right.
If that had happened, and then you got feedback from the other nations that allow open transgender service, I think I'd be pragmatic and might be favorable toward adjusting that policy. But that's not what happened.
I agree. What I'm saying, though, is for especially religious conservatives, this is a fundamental ideological question. It's not about the practical.
Oh, I agree, but I don't think as a society that we have to humor like the beliefs of any particular group, right? Whether that's transgender or religious conservatives.
Yeah, I don't disagree, but
I'd just be pragmatic about it.
Right, but I don't think it's preposterous or benighted at all to think, you know what? If you're a biological male and you still have the anatomy of a male, you shouldn't be allowed to serve in situations with other women. You shouldn't be allowed in women's shelters. You shouldn't be allowed in women's bathrooms, etc.
Yeah, I understand the concern there. And that's why, as I said, I think if you had feedback on the ground from people who had much better information than you or I do that there were real
Right, but again,
problems.
you're looking at the practical consequences. For the religious conservative, it's a lie. At the root of this apple is the rotten core of this lie. So it doesn't really matter. And it's the same to them as transracialism would be to the left. Now, you and I might be able to cope with transracialism, try to be practical about it, whatever. I don't know how I feel about it. But you do agree that regardless of the practical consequences of transracialism, you would have an enthusiastic denunciations from the left.
Oh, I agree with that.
Right. And
Yes.
I'm not even sure that you shouldn't.
I would actually, I'm in favor of encouraging transracialism because it would probably, if it spread, it could rapidly break apart the affirmative action system that we have.
Yeah, well, it would undermine the affirmative
But I
action
guess my
system.
point, I understand.
I'm just saying, look,
I'm,
like we have an ideological problem here,
yeah,
which is like religious conservatives are not going to feel comfortable with the ideology of transgenderism.
No, I agree with that, and I'm somewhat sympathetic. But again, I guess my point is we if the policy works reasonably well,
Mhm.
and we get talented, open transgender people in the military
Right,
performing important duties, and the
right.
commanders are positive toward that.
Mhm.
I don't think that we should allow conservative evangelical ideology to dictate our policy and say, well, that's not that it's mendacious, so let's not do that. That's all I'm
Well,
saying.
yeah, I think I mostly agree with that. Although I suppose the more reasonable conservative argument here that would go beyond just the ideology itself is mendacious to a broader prudential concern, which is it's hard to know what the long-term effects of this ideology will be, but
Mhm.
we don't know because for most of the history of the West, we haven't had such an ideology, and we should just be cautious and prudent about it. Now, I
Yeah,
think
agreed.
they are in the military, and I think, look, if you
Yes.
this is why I try to persuade conservatives that if you want your policies to win, don't associate them with Trump because Trump comes in and fucks them up by being so incompetent and blunderbuss about them.
Right.
Right. And so now you take this issue where if you had some prudential concerns voiced reasonably by a president who was competent about it and also like very careful not to make it sound as though it was motivated by these uh, biases and discriminatory beliefs or what people would call discriminatory beliefs, it would have been much more successful. That would be
Right.
much more
It,
successful of a way to do it.
in fact, what would have happened is you wouldn't even do a memorandum or an executive order at all. You would have been in private consultation with the
Yes, correct.
relevant parties, and you
Right.
would have instituted lower level
Right.
policies.
And this is what pisses me off that you sort of notice about. I mean, it's always been a problem with politics, but it's hard to imagine that it hasn't been made dramatically worse by social media and I mean even from like C-SPAN all the way up through social media, which is people do in public the things that they should do in private,
Right.
and they do them in public in a more incendiary way, and also in a way that's almost guaranteed to ruin any potential compromise that you could make privately.
Yes.
Right. And
Agreed.
it's so obnoxious because in many things it just undermines your ability to solve the actual problems.
Yes. Yes. Agreed.
So at any rate, there's going to be a lot of storm and stress about this, but
I actually, I've thought about it, and I don't think there's going to be. I
no,
think
no, I
it's,
mean now there is. I
oh
agree.
yeah,
I
I
think
think
it'll be
it'll,
like gay
yeah,
marriage. It's just like whatever.
right. It'll last for a few weeks or something, and then you'll, when you look at conservative media like the National Review, you'll see that they don't even
Right,
talk about it
right.
anymore.
It'll just be yeah, it'll just totally culture. Our culture
And
will assimilate this, and it
I,
won't matter.
I
probably.
think this is also, to me, an important component about being quote unquote anti woke is to think carefully about each of these policy proposals or ideas instead of just categorically saying that's wokeism and dismissing it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Although I don't, I think this is actually an issue that most of the secular right doesn't give a shit about. And in fact,
Yeah, that's
you,
probably
you
fair.
know, like if you had a more, so it's like the Populist Party in the United States formed an alliance with evangelicals through, just by contingency.
Right.
And that means you have to give evangelicals certain things that they want. But in fact, a lot of populist voters don't care about this. In
Yes.
fact, I suspect many of them are sympathetic to it.
I suspect so as well. And as I noted, I mean, it seems that it's quite popular, right? So I
Yes,
don't think it's
overall.
a
Yeah,
divisive policy. It's like,
right,
no, you have like 70% support. I
right.
mean, so let's move on from there, where I think our views are somewhat simpatico that, probably Biden reversing the executive order was probably not bad.
Yeah.
To the minimum wage debate. This is more of a wonky issue, less contact with sacred values.
Yes,
So
which is
again,
actually good because it means that you get better, although there is obviously, it's a very politicized field,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it
that's
doesn't
right.
have, you're not going to get fired if you argue the wrong thing.
Yes. And so again, to be clear, the Biden administration is pushing for a $15 federal minimum wage. It is
Mhm.
currently 7.25. Most states are above 7.25. There are certain localities that are at 15,
Right.
and many states are moving slowly toward 15.
Mhm.
Okay. So again, this is actually a policy proposal, though, where I'd note that it is quite popular.
Yes.
So overall, according to the polling I was able to look at, about 67% of Americans favor a $15 minimum wage, including 43% of individuals who identify as Republican or lean Republican.
Mhm.
We also had the experience of Florida on November 3rd, where they passed a $15 minimum wage. This was Amendment 2. So Florida both went for Trump,
Yes.
and
And
with
passed.
a 60% majority, a quote unquote super majority vote, passed this amendment to move Florida's minimum wage
Right.
to.
Now, imagine if you were just an economic leftist. Shouldn't you be absolutely thrilled with the direction the country has taken? I mean, you're to the point now at which a $15 minimum wage is favored by the majority of the population. And in fact, many Republicans, at least Republican voters, are happy with it. I mean, that's an
Yes.
enormous victory for the sort of economic left.
Yeah, I agree. I think, except for the problem is the populist right, where there's this room to go left economically, they
Right.
mostly focus on like block immigration, or we need to keep low productivity businesses around so they can fail in their competition with chain stores,
Well,
and attacking trade
that might
deals
be
with.
the tendentious way to put it. But
Well,
yes,
it is a tendon,
but they do care about, I mean, I care about immigration. They should too. But I think
but not
this,
for not
no,
as much for
not as
economic
much for that.
reasons.
But
But
this is, you can see this is the problem is, again, you're a populist on the right, and now you have a left wing, I mean, moderate left wing, center of the left, not center in general, president who's forwarding policies that in an ideal world maybe you'd like to forward to show
yes,
that you're down with the people. Now it
yes,
puts you in a tough situation because what do? Do you support it and give the Democratic president a big bipartisan victory, or do you find problems with it?
right. So just So we know that it's overall popular among the people.
Yes.
So what is the economic kind of consensus on this? Well, I think this is actually interesting because we have good data from economists on their thinking of minimum wage laws.
Mhm.
And if you go to 1978, they had an American Economic Association member survey. 90% of economists who filled this survey out agreed that minimum wages substantially lower employment among low wage workers.
Mhm.
Now they've done these surveys multiple times since, and you see this clear pattern where the number of economists supporting that has declined all the
Right.
way to now. You got a 2015 survey that only 26% of economists agreed with the that
Well,
proposition.
so what you have to know is how much are you hiking minimum wage? Because everybody agrees that if minimum wage were $100 an hour, it would have a disemployment effect.
Yeah, so the question as asked to economists was specifically $15 an hour.
Well, in 2015, you mean?
Yeah, in
Yeah.
2015 it was, and then we have the Chicago Booth poll where they asked if the federal minimum wage is raised gradually to 15 per hour,
Mhm.
the employment rate for low wage US workers will be substantially lower than it would be under the status quo. On that, 26% of economists agreed, 38% said they were uncertain, and 24% said they disagreed. So
So,
the kind of consensus view is not really, probably
yeah.
not.
But see, this is an issue that has become, even though there aren't really sacred values at stake, it has become politicized.
Yeah, so they've noted that on these polls that labor economists and younger PhDs tend to be most supportive of raising the minimum
Right. And
wage.
I've seen and heard economists complaining about how politicized it is if you try
That's
to
right.
publish or debate these issues. And so let's just look at it theoretically before talking about a little bit of the evidence. So the
Okay.
concerns are with the minimum wage, the major concern is it has a disemployment effect, right? If you make labor more expensive artificially, firms won't be able to afford as much of it, so they will cut hours.
Yeah,
Sometimes that means cutting jobs, etc.
so you will potentially increase the supply of job seekers because now there's a higher wage, right?
Possibly, but I don't think that's the
No, but
important part of the
no,
equation.
I agree. But you will simultaneously, and more importantly, you will decrease the demand for low skilled
Well,
workers.
you'll decrease the demand because low skilled workers will be artificially priced in the way that you would decrease demand for ketchup if suddenly it became $7 instead of $2.
And here the argument is that this is going to be especially difficult in low cost of living areas and states and for small
Yes,
businesses. Like,
right,
yes, larger businesses can absorb the cost, and that's why Amazon, Target, Walmart, and Kobani, et cetera, are all favorable toward a high minimum wage.
right,
But Joe's Ma and Pa shop won't be able to offer a
right.
$15.
So there's this concern, and this makes sense theoretically, at least. So we'll just say, like, obviously, theoretically, if you increase the price artificially of labor, it would have a disemployment effect. And we can think
Yes.
about this if you did it to $100, let's say, obviously it would. The other,
Yes.
another concern is how do firms absorb the cost of this? And
That's right.
one idea is that they just increase the price of their goods. And so, like, say in the fast food industry, if they increase fast food, that's a regressive tax, right? Because it's it's more out of the budget of relatively poor people, food is, than of relatively wealthy
That's right.
people.
And the same would go for Walmart, where
Yes,
they
exactly. If
have
they
extremely
increase their
low
goods, right,
prices. That helps poorer
right.
people increase the minimum wage. They have to increase their products. That disproportionately hurts poor consumers.
Right, and we have a number. There are
Also, Also, just as a note, another effect that it would have is it leads to capital deepening, right? That is, businesses and industries would invest more in capital, right,
Right.
to replace labor.
Right. So I mean, put in more concrete terms, if you're McDonald's, you don't want to have as many workers now because they're more expensive. So
Right.
you take money and you invest it in kiosks for people, or some kind of machine that cooks food instead of an individual worker, right?
That's right. Right. Yeah.
Now, that could be good in the sense that it may increase productivity. It could be bad in the short term because it reduces jobs, right? So there are
Right.
trade-offs there.
Yeah.
There's a whole gob of empirical data on this and of studies, including studies that were done after Seattle raised minimum wage. And I would say, it seems to me that the general result of these studies, when you look at them, the consistent pattern of results that you find is there is a disemployment effect, and it falls mostly on younger people, high schoolers, uneducated people, low-skilled workers.
Mhm.
And it's real, but there are also benefits for minimum wage. And if you look at the CBO projections, they project that there are real benefits. If you went to $15, I think you would increase the overall family wealth below the poverty line by what, like 8 billion or something? But it would be.
So the CBO, their forecast is that if you increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour, by 2029, families who were their annual income was lower than the poverty threshold, their income would increase by 6.5 billion.
Okay.
Families that were between 1 and 3 times the poverty threshold, their income would increase by 12.1 billion. And then families 3 and greater, their income overall would decline, presumably because
substantially.
Yeah, because overall consumer goods would be more expensive.
Also overall, the CBO projects that an increased minimum wage would cause the economy to grow at a slightly slower rate than otherwise.
Yeah, that's right, and it would lead to a net loss of jobs.
Yeah,
so
the 1.3 million.
1.2 to 3.3 is their estimate for jobs lost.
The last one that I looked at was 1.3 to 3.7. But
okay, so somewhere in that ballpark.
1%.
But so what's important here is that there are real costs,
right?
But mostly what's happening is a redistribution from wealthier families to less wealthy families.
Right. So it's like and so what you get from wonks, conservative wonks, right, is they don't like this because they see it as a blunt instrument that ends up actually costing economic growth, and it just ends up you're not necessarily paying workers more. You might put it into the price, which ends up making it more expensive to live anyway, or the welfare state or benefits shrink anyway, so it doesn't end up helping the worker as much as it should. And what they would rather see is some kind of a targeted plan, right? Some kind of, let's just take our tax money and pay these workers more with the tax money, right?
Yeah, so you could have some wage subsidies, or if you were going to increase the minimum wage, you would want it to be adjusted to the local, like maybe consumer price index or cost of living.
So Arkansas doesn't need to have the same minimum wage as California.
That's right. And again, if we lived in a pragmatic technocratic society, I would agree with those conservative points, but we don't. So why not take a policy that has a redistributive effect that helps low income Americans?
Right.
That's so cheap to enforce. It doesn't require hiring thousands of bureaucrats. It's just make a $15 minimum wage.
Easy
and
to
it's
understand.
Popular.
It's easy to understand for people. It's popular and it's cheap to enforce. And let me make a comparison. So throughout throughout post David Ricardo, right? But really, you had like the sort of technocrat economists in the 70s, 80s, 90s would argue free trade is better for everybody. Everybody wins. Now, it's true, they would say, that these places that get hit with influxes of imports might pay a price for it in the immediate, but who cares, because the pie's bigger and we'll just figure out a way to filter some of the pie to the losers, and then everybody's a winner.
Yes.
That was like the argument. Now, the problem, of course, is you never filtered the money to the losers. Right? Right.
Yes.
So,
and well, the other problem is that the wins are widely shared and therefore attenuated per each individual, whereas the losses are concentrated among
Sure.
certain sectors,
Correct.
geographically and
Right.
economically.
Right. So it really, you're dealing with an imperfect system with real humans, right, who suffer if they lose their job or whatever. And therefore, this economic textbook argument didn't really work out when you applied it to reality. There were real costs, and you never ended up actually doing these technocratic policies that you could have done.
Right. And even if you did them, you would say that the trade policies failed politically, even if they were economically successful.
Oh, right. But they might not have failed politically so much if you didn't have, like, say, communities on the East Coast that got hit by the China shock, just completely going under, so to speak. I mean, businesses shutting down, people losing their jobs, etc. That's how I feel about these wonk proposals on the right with the minimum wage. In an ideal world, it would be better to do them. It would be better to be more targeted about it. And if you could, if that were politically viable, I would support it. But it doesn't seem as though they are, because nobody's really making noise about passing any of these more targeted policies.
That's right.
So
I think of it as just a cheap labor regulation, right?
Yes, but to be clear, we accept that there are costs to this, and
Yes.
and that's there probably is really a disappointment effect. People, they cut hours, right? That's what the studies in Seattle seem to suggest. And the newest study from McDonald's, for example, seems to suggest that costs do go up a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
It's a redistribution that I think you could justify and say it's worth taking a small hit on overall growth and efficiency to make a redistributed policy like
right.
this.
And compare it to what happened in the auto industry in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? It is certainly the case that as you formed powerful unions, specifically the United Auto Workers, that people had to pay more for their vehicles than they otherwise would have. It also created a productive sector, because high pay means we need to make sure that we can produce these things efficiently, and we're going to invest a lot in capital. And it also created a lot of well-paying middle-class jobs with good benefits for people.
Right. So ultimately, I'm completely, what would I say? I'm theoretically pragmatic here. Like, I don't care how we do it. I think some amount of redistribution is the conservative policy, because it creates more social stability and more buy-in into the system, so long as it doesn't motivate people not to work in the way that you could argue the UBI would. And some people argue there are actually it would incentivize employment in a way that welfare doesn't, but we can debate that. But I'm concerned about, I want people to work, but to get good wages for working.
Right. That's the other thing that's somewhat peculiar to me about some of the conservative Republican view on this. Not I guess not conservative, but non-populist Republicans who think that, more libertarian type Republicans, let's say, that your whole shtick is that people, like, working is good and welfare has disincentive effects, right? this is an example of making jobs more desirable,
Mhm.
right? Which presumably, if you believe people respond to incentives, would increase people's desire to work.
Right. Now, I suppose the wonk libertarian would argue, yeah, but at the expense of, say, 1 million jobs or something. And
Sure, yeah, yeah.
there's a better way to do this.
But
There's
look
a
at,
more efficient tax path we can take here. Which again,
yeah,
you and I agree in principle. If you could do that, I'd be in
that's right.
favor of it.
Yeah,
So
if you right, I mean, I'm in favor of sectoral bargaining, and then you could do away with the minimum wage altogether. It would be
right,
unnecessary.
right,
But
yeah,
in the United States right now, that's just
yes.
not feasible. And again, like when you have a Congress that barely functions, you're
Mhm,
thinking about, well, what could we pass that's quite popular?
mhm.
This seems to me like a no-brainer. This will pass, it's
Well,
popular.
I think I would go for a $12 federal minimum wage and then let states do what they want beyond that.
I think the pragmatic to me would be slowly phase in 15, and then at that point allow states
Well, I
to,
would vote for that.
yeah.
If that were on the table, I'd vote for it.
And then you could
Yeah.
actually put in the bill that after you hit 15, the minimum wage would be indexed to
Yes.
inflation and the cost
Inflation.
of living,
Yeah.
and then states would diverge given their own political
Yeah, and
economies.
like what you would like to see ideally, I think, is some kind of uh now I'd have to I have read about this before. I'm clearly I'm not an expert on labor economics, so I don't know all of the complexities here, but there are ways to create a minimum wage system that allows people who are in high school to be paid less, for example.
Right.
Because one of the complaints from mostly libertarian esque or right leaning economists is that this can take valuable experience away from younger people who would love to go work somewhere and just learn the skills, but now they're so expensive that the firms won't hire them.
Mhm.
So there is a way around that. And I there are other countries that do that, that
Yeah,
they,
and you could also institute some partial exceptions
right,
for extremely small businesses, like
right,
family owned and run businesses that
right,
have fewer than 15 employees or something. There are
right.
a lot of ways that you could target this, but I think overall it's something that I think it's good. I think again, it's a policy that if Trump were president and proposing it, populists would get behind it immediately, and talk would be talking about how this is a huge win for the working class.
Well, it's notable that a lot of populists haven't really made uh, uh, populists haven't made a lot of noise against this, really,
Yes, yeah, that's right.
right? And to the extent that you get criticism of it from conservatives, at least publicly, like political conservatives, it's often, this isn't fair to Louisiana or Mississippi or these places that have very low cost of living. And then you get more
That's right.
technocratic arguments from people like Robert Verbruggen at the National Review who make the more, well, we should do like there's a more efficient strategy here or whatever.
Just as a technical note, the disparities in cost of living between the states are not as large as people tend to think.
Yeah, I
So
think people have this idea that like in Arkansas you can live on $2 an hour or something.
right, so just to be clear, if you have a $15 national minimum wage, that's basically equivalent of $17.90 in Mississippi, the poorest state,
Mhm.
and 12.66 in Hawaii,
Yeah,
the state with the highest cost of living.
right.
So the disparity is not that large. I mean,
Well, I
it's
think
there,
right, it's
but
real, but I think what people think is compare the price of housing in Alabama to San Francisco, or from
right,
like some city in Alabama to San Francisco, and you're like, holy shit! But
yes.
that's not most of the stuff that you get, food, health, etc. It doesn't have that intense of a disparity.
Right, and the housing issue obviously is extremely
Yeah, it's its
complex.
own. own thing. So
Right.
I guess I would just say, yeah, I would vote for this. I'm open to other people's proposals. I'm not a theoretical dogmatist about this at all. To me, it's all about figuring out ways to pay people more money for doing work, which is what we want to do. We want to incentivize people to do meaningful jobs.
Yeah, that I agree. We want work to confer dignity, and I also think that we have a real inequality problem, and most of the ways to address that are political non-starters. This, however
Yes.
little it will do to address that issue, it does something, and it's at least politically feasible.
Yes, agreed. I would agree with
So
that.
let's move on then to the final topic where I think that you and I may disagree, and that is the Ezra Klein article in Vox before he ditched Vox for the more prestigious New York Times.
He co-founded Vox and then moved on to better things.
Yes, his definitive case for ending the filibuster.
Yes.
So what's your kind of overall impression of Klein's argument, and where do you
So
stand on this?
the article is the best and worst of Klein. So the best is he's a very thoughtful, intelligent human who tries to be fair and approaches things rationally. The bad of Ezra Klein is that he can be tendentious in this cool, calm way. And
Yes.
so he makes these racial points in there that are maybe true as a matter of fact, but that are not essential to the actual debate, so far as I
Well,
can tell.
before we get into the actual debate, why don't you just summarize what his basic thesis is then?
So the thesis is we should get rid of the filibuster. The filibuster, for people who don't know, is a weird it's a weird tradition that developed in the Senate. It's not in the Constitution. It's not a part of originalism, whereby, and it changed a little bit the number that you needed for cloture, but right now it's 60 people need to vote just to get a bill to pass from the debate stage to the voting stage, right? Now,
Right.
why is this important? Because it means if you come out with a bill, people can debate it until it's dead. Now you don't debate really anymore. Now you just say we're going to filibuster this, and that means you can't get it through unless you get 60 votes. The history of this is interesting, but it's not necessary for Klein's argument, really. So his argument is, I mean, he has
Okay, so importantly, point here is that even if you quote unquote win the Senate, that is your political party
correct.
has 55 senators, and you have the
Yes.
House and you have the presidency,
Yes.
you cannot pass legislation
Yes.
because it will get filibustered and you will not have 60 votes.
Legislation that is budget neutral now, right? Because you can go
That's
through
right.
reconciliation. So let's
Yes.
yes. So Klein's argument is that this thwarts the will of the majority
Mhm.
in a way that is at this point intolerable to our conception of ourselves as a democracy, and it's not in line with other democracies. And furthermore, we already have a lot of checkpoints on democracy in the United States, because one argument that conservatives often forward is this is just one check on majoritarianism run amok. So
Mhm.
Klein's point is, well, we already have lots of checks. This is one that's intolerable, because common sense tells you that people think, I vote for my party, I get the policies they were telling me they were going to pass. But
Mhm.
that's not actually how it happens, because even if you vote for your party and you get 58 senators, you have the House and you have the president, you still can't pass the policies that you said you were going to pass because
Right.
of this arcane, recondite, bizarre norm that is not in the Constitution even. It
Right.
was not foreseen. It was not something Madison said we should do in the Federalist Papers. In fact, both Madison and Hamilton have comments that make it clear that they didn't want it to be beyond a majority in the Senate.
Right. And also, even without the filibuster, the Senate is anti-majoritarian. That's how
Correct.
it was set up.
Yes.
So,
Now, to be fair, it was much more anti-majoritarian before the 17th Amendment.
mm, but
But
it's
that is to say, the 17th Amendment, so it used to be, the Senate was sort of conceived as this body that would be far removed from the effervescence of the people, because
that's right.
senators were selected by people at the state. They were not voted popularly.
Yeah, they
So
were
they were
selected by
not
state legislators.
exactly. Now, the
Right.
17th Amendment made them, they were now directly elected by the
But let's
people.
note the malapportionment in the Senate is quite stark, right?
Yes,
So
it is.
if
That's
you
right.
look at the median state in
Mhm.
the Senate,
Right.
it is 6.6 percentage points more Republican than the nation overall.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a huge advantage already for
So in other
Republicans in the
words,
Senate.
let's just think about this. If you open the Senate up on a per capita basis,
Yes.
you would have many more senators from New York and from California than you would from Wyoming or North Dakota.
That's right. So the Senate is already biased toward white rural areas and against more diverse urban areas in terms of its
it is
apportionment.
now. To be clear, it wasn't designed.
Oh
that
no,
way.
I agree, but
Right.
that's how it is now. So what happens is
It was
if you
designed in an era. I mean, we don't think this way so much anymore, but early Americans thought of themselves primarily as members of a state.
right,
And they felt loyalty to their state, and states didn't want their rights taken away by other states. And so the
that's right.
Senate was a way to say each state. In the House, it's based on population. In the Senate, it is each state gets two. So it's the more equal if
Right.
you conceive the system from the level of states and federalism.
Although the House is also slightly biased toward Republicans due to
Correct.
gerrymandering.
Yes, it is, but it was based on population. So
That's
states
right.
get different numbers of representatives.
Right. So there are examples, actually quite a few examples of majoritarian use of the filibuster, right? But when that occurs, it's Democrats filibustering Republicans because there's already a bias against Democrats in
Right.
the
So,
Senate.
but I think this is the wrong way to think about it, because we have a federalist system in
Mhm.
which states are the political actors, not individual people. So I think when I think you can separate the filibuster from this other majoritarian argument, but I think making the majoritarian argument based on the fact that the Senate, each state gets two people, I don't like that argument, because I like federalism and I like thinking of the country as a patchwork of states that have their own prerogatives. And I want to protect state prerogatives by keeping equal representation in the Senate.
Well, they have equal representation in the Senate.
Yeah, I know. I said I
Okay.
want to keep it. And I
So-
think it's a bad argument to say, well, having equal number of senators is already anti-majoritarian. Yeah, it was designed to be, and I like it that way because I want to think of our system from a state's perspective.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But then you're adding on top of that the
I agree.
filibuster.
But let's just so this is what I would do with Klein. I would take that argument out. I don't
Okay.
find that persuasive.
So your argument is that your philosophy is that Wyoming should have equal say over
Yes.
the legislative agenda of the United States as California or New
Yes.
York or Texas.
Yes. And
Okay,
I think
that's
I
fair.
think and I think the reason it should is because I want to protect some sense of local political identity.
Mhm.
And I like that you can have some local creativity so that California can be different from Texas, can be different from Wyoming. And I
Mhm.
want people to think about that because it allows a little bit of diversity within a broad country. And I think that's like a valve on potential increasing hostility at the national level.
Okay, I can
However,
accede to that and say, yes, if you didn't have the filibuster,
No, the
I
filibuster is irrelevant here, though.
Right, setting the filibuster to the side, just focusing on this. I also like the idea that less populous states have equal representation in the Senate. It probably helps our sense of comity to the extent that there is any left in the United States.
Right.
And it does help like a state such as Montana from feeling like they're not getting absolutely plowed by a
Right.
majority of like urbanites on the East Coast.
Right. Now, I
But the
must say, I think I did change my view about the filibuster, not just from this Klein piece, but from reading other people, because there's really no originalist defense of it. And so it's striking to me that conservatives, that Republicans who are, I mean, even the intellectuals who tend to be originalists, defend the filibuster feverishly. And I don't understand it. It's not what was intended, at least at the founding. It was just like it ended up being this accidental discovery, if you will, right?
right,
And in fact, again, Madison and Hamilton both explicitly stated that they wanted it to be mere majority in the Senate in the Federalist Papers. I think there are two passages about this. So if you're going to argue for the filibuster, which there are reasonable arguments for it that we can get into, you have to admit that there's no originalist justification for it. And in
right.
fact, it's a violation, most plausibly, it's a violation of originalist expectations.
Yes. And I think that's true. And I think it has a deleterious political effect. For one thing, having ineffectual government really does open up the political arena for populists, right? Because one thing that populists do really well is they demagogue
But
I can fix this, right?
yeah, I don't think that I don't think this is much of a cause of populism personally. I think populism is more a result of the political establishment not addressing certain concerns.
Those concerns would be easier to address without a filibuster.
I'm not sure that that's the case.
Okay.
I don't know about that, but you are right that the filibuster. So I'll just make the pro-conservative argument. You make the argument against it.
Okay.
So the conservative argument for it is it compels debate and compromise, because instead of passing your legislation with 50 votes plus the VP or 51, you have to get 60.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to debate with these people, you have to compromise. The other conservative argument is, the status quo, and I think this is more of just like what would you say, like an intuition rather than an articulated argument, but conservatives generally are a little bit happier with the status quo, and the filibuster makes it harder to change the status quo. So your default is basically status quo because it's harder to get 60 votes than to get 51.
Yeah. So
right. So those are two major conservative arguments. The latter
argument may be true, although I could challenge that and see what you think about that. The former argument is clearly just false, right? As a matter of fact, it doesn't encourage debate. And as Klein notes, when you look at the Senate, nobody's debating these bills. They just don't do that.
I agree.
What it actually does is it strengthens the minority party because they actually benefit from obstruction, because that's usually blamed on the party in power. And then they get punished at the ballot, right, in the midterms or in the next presidential election cycle. The other negative effect that it has, well, two. So one, it does.
Wait, to interject there, let's imagine this scenario because it's a good one. I think this is in Klein's article, but let's like tweak it a bit. So what do you mean when you say the minority party benefits from tanking the majority party's legislative agenda? Think
Right.
about how that works. Now, let's suppose you and I work for a boss and we can help the boss. And if we do, he gets credit for it, right?
Yeah.
And we don't get credit for it. In fact, we might even get hurt by our voters or the people under us for helping the boss.
Right.
Or we can undermine the boss, even though we think his idea is good, and then we become the boss.
Right. And then we can even put in place that same policy.
Exactly. Right.
Call it something else.
Right. And that is true, that clearly those are the incentives in a Senate in which you have a very rigid party system. Now, and it's important to know the founders did not imagine a party system like this.
That's right.
They thought the Senate would fight for its own prerogatives against the executive. They didn't know that it would split into parties and completely capitulate to the executive as long as they were in the same party, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
So a lot of these problems that we have because of the incentives of party systems weren't imagined by the founders, at least originally. I mean, obviously Madison realized soon that there were going to be factions, et cetera, but the system wasn't really built with that in mind.
Yeah. So a few other kind of points in favor of ditching the filibuster. So it frustrates majorities who have policy goals that they want to advance.
Right.
I think that's not really debatable, right? I mean, clearly,
Yeah,
I mean, that's
clearly it does. That's what it's for.
Right.
No, I mean, here's the thing, right? Though,
If
if the conservative fantasy world were reality, I think the filibuster would be good. That is to say, if conservatives would actually, or liberals for that matter, if the oppositional party really would cooperate and compromise, I think it might be a good idea to have a filibuster, because then you would moderate and temper the legislation. In practice, however, it's not as if, like, you can look at the Affordable Care Act, the contentious debates there. Republicans weren't going to vote for it no matter what.
Yes.
So it wasn't
agreed.
actually doing that.
So it also encourages policy drift. And I think policy drift is more pernicious than people think. That is, you have these huge political, economic, and social problems. There are solutions to them, or partial solutions. We don't solve them, but you engage in optimal policies that can mitigate some of the worst effects of whatever is happening in your society. So instead, what happens is you just let it get worse. And then because we have this negative polarization, the parties just blame each other and nothing gets done. And then a final point that I think is underappreciated, because you can pass policy through reconciliation without the threat of filibuster, that is, you just need a simple majority. The parties really put a priority on policies that can pass through the reconciliation process. That is, those that have to do with taxing and spending.
Right.
So for Republicans, that's tax cuts, right? They really prioritize those because we know we can get this done with 51 votes. We saw that in the Trump administration. But you can't do, like, regulatory policies, climate change, gun control, or I was thinking, like, on the right, immigration policy, populist laws dealing with, let's say, big tech, laws on affirmative action or critical race theory, abortion. Those are all things that you can't do through reconciliation.
What Klein calls ethno-nationalism tendentiously, we might call ethno-traditionalism less tendentiously, and you could try to get those things through. But my hot take is, I don't think it would really matter if we got rid of the filibuster. After thinking about it carefully, I could be wrong, but I think if you look at most of the causes of dysfunction in the Congress, it's not the filibuster.
I agree with that. I don't think it would I don't think it would dial down negative polarization that much.
I don't think it would at
or
all.
Compromise. But one thing you can say is I do think it would lead to better policy making. For example, we'd have a public option right now if it weren't for the filibuster.
I'm not. So what I would worry about though is what would end up happening is, let's say you pass a bill,
Mhm.
and often when you pass a complicated, complex bill, it takes a few years before you even start enacting it, right? So
Yes.
you pass a bill in 2024,
Mhm.
Republicans win in 2026 midterm, and
Mhm.
then they're just going to overturn your bill.
Let me ask you something. Do you think we'd be better or worse off right now if we had a public option and the Dream Act than the status quo right now?
Dream Act, I'm a little skeptical about, but
Okay.
I'm willing to listen to. Public option, I'm in favor of. But here's the thing: Obamacare would have been repealed if I guess Republicans didn't have the president, so Obama vetoed it. But you can imagine that that's just a quirk of history. It just happens to be the case
No,
that
Republicans couldn't even repeal Obamacare through reconciliation.
okay, but to be clear, that was 8, well, not 8 years. When did ACA officially pass? 2009, 10?
Yeah.
It was well later. So let's be clear. Like, the thing that happened is Obama beat Romney in 2012. The
Yep.
reason Obama beat Romney is not because of healthcare. It's because Obama was more likable, right? I mean, this is the problem with elections, is like, if you had replaced Obama with somebody who was promoting the exact same policy vision as Obama was, but was 50% less charismatic, Romney might have won.
Okay. I'm not sure what the exact argument is here.
No, my point is, what I worry about with getting rid of the filibuster is, say you pass a policy in 2022. Now let's say Republicans win the Senate in 2024. They repeal it.
Okay. I
Right.
can live with that.
Right, but my point is, I don't think it would end up doing that much because you're so polarized. The problem is that
I disagree because I think what happened, like, let's say that you pass the Affordable Care Act with a public option.
Mhm.
Okay, well, now when you run against Romney, voters know that that's up for this election, right?
Yes, but here's the problem.
No, but
The
hold on.
policy isn't enacted yet, so the voters don't actually know the consequences.
Okay, well, right, but I would.
The feedback is so slow that you don't actually get to experience.
So
Hey, what? Yeah, go ahead.
But that's at least better in my
Possibly,
view
yeah.
than what you would have now, where you pass this bill because you got lucky and you had 60 senators, not for the entire process, by the way.
Right.
So you had to do some stuff through reconciliation, but you pass
Right.
this very suboptimal bill
Mhm.
that's extremely complicated,
Mhm.
right? And it's becoming more popular over time.
Right.
And then you're trying to expand it instead of passing a better bill at the time that would have gone into effect more rapidly. And then you could run on, hey, I passed the public option for you. Do you want to? If Mitt Romney wins, that's done.
Right, but I'm
It's
saying,
at least more it's not perfect, but it's more immediate feedback than what we
yeah,
have right now.
maybe I don't think it would really do much. I mean, I think though the burden of argument should be, this is where my views switched, because I used to think, look, like, you want minority faction to have this veto point. And I think you do, and I think you can argue for that. That's a kind of Calhoun-like argument. It's not automatically bad just because Calhoun was bad on slavery, which is what some people do. And Klein does that with the filibuster, and he associates it with, okay, well, historically Democrats used the filibuster to avoid civil rights bills and getting rid of Jim Crow. Yeah, they did, and that's bad. But the main thing is, I lost my train of thought. So having a majority, I know. The burden of the argument is on the side that's promoting the filibuster because it was not the original conception of the Senate. So I would say my view is just, look, I don't know what the effects would be. I'm not sure. I don't think they would be dramatic either way. I think it could increase polarization and hostility. It could decrease it a little bit. I'm not sure. I do know that if you're going to argue for it and you're going to make it, you're going to claim you're an originalist, then you should make the argument for it, and you should have more evidence on your side. Although you could make the conservative, just prudential argument, right? The Burkean argument. Well, we've had the filibuster, so it's dangerous to, if you're going to get rid of it, you better bring some pretty good arguments because we know what we've got with it.
Yeah, that's probably not a great argument to keep it.
Right. It might not be, because I don't think many people are praising how functional the Congress is.
So here, my view, I think my kind of bird's eye view is, if you have an entrenched party system, what you want to do is, to the extent possible, have the political parties, have them be able to enact their legislative agendas, and then allow for voters, right, to say, I like that or I don't like that. Right. Now, if you didn't have a two-party system like we do, if you had something more resembling like the New Deal coalition, it's not that big of a deal, right? You don't have the ideological sorting. You can get kind of Southern Democrats siding with Republicans, etc. But when you have the clear ideological support, sort, now I think you have to make it so if this party wins, they should be able to enact that agenda. And if people don't like it, good, like elect the other party, and they can, right? They can.
I don't necessarily,
like, for example, just as one thought, like for immigration restrictionists, I think you could see, like, without the filibuster, if you had a populist backlash to the excesses of the woke Democratic coalition, you could elect like a Tom Cotton, get the Senate, get the House, and you could actually pass restrictionist legislation, and Democrats wouldn't be able to obstruct it.
Right.
But so when there's overreach, you have the ability to respond to that.
See, this is why I don't think it would matter all that much, because what would happen is, so you pass some sort of immigration reform. By the time it actually did anything, there would be a reaction to it. And in 2 years or 4 years, the other coalition would probably just overturn it.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can argue that that's maybe the way we should run things.
But you agree that probably the public option wouldn't get overturned because it'd be popular, that's the Medicaid one expansion.
Yeah. Well, this is what I was saying with Romney. The reason the public option would not have been overturned is simply because of the charisma of Obama. Because if Romney had won in 2012, Obamacare would have been overturned, right? The reason it wasn't is because Obama won, period. That's it. It's not because there's some like rational voters cared more about this or not.
I don't completely, we don't know the counterfactual.
You don't think Obama vetoed it? You don't think Romney would not have vetoed it?
If the Republicans if they had the Senate, the House, and the presidency, they're playing with live ammunition now. So you're going to be
2012 people didn't care about it.
So 2012, 13, you're going to be the party that takes away the public option. Fine. Like, if it hasn't even been.
But your views require this sort of rational feedback between party gets in, party passes a policy gets implemented, voters see how they feel about it. In reality, however, it takes multiple years before a complicated policy even gets implemented, let alone you can sense the effects of it. So what really happens, like take Obamacare, what really happened was you passed it, it took a while to implement it. A lot of the things were created so that they would go into effect in 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, etc. Republicans demagogued the issue and just completely lambasted the thing. Their voters agreed with them for a period of time until 6 years later, when
Mhm.
it became more, the effects were clear, it became more of the status quo. That's what
But
I'm saying.
I agree with that. But do you agree with me that if Obamacare were actually a catastrophic failure, the
Yes.
Republican Party would have been able to repeal it because that would
Yes,
have been
filibuster or not, they would have, though.
right. Well,
Yeah.
especially without the filibuster.
Sure, but I think if it were a catastrophic failure, if it
Or
were,
let's say it's an overall failure, it's not catastrophic. It's just it turns out that it's bad policy. Republicans would be able to overturn it because it would be popular to overturn it. So I agree with you.
sure.
There's not direct feedback, but it's more direct without the filibuster than it is now, where you can elect Biden,
Uh-huh.
you can give the Democrats the Senate, you can
Mhm.
give the Democrats the House, and
Mhm.
he can't pass anything.
Right.
So this $15 minimum wage that we're debating about, it's not going to pass. Right? Nobody's going to pass that. It's just not happening unless Democrats ditch the filibuster, and
Right.
Sinema and Manchin have made clear that that's not happening.
Right. And this is troubling because you can see it both ways, and you can always think about specific cases in which you would hate not to have the filibuster and cases in which you would like it. Just for example, with the I would not have voted for, I would have voted for Trump if it weren't for the filibuster, for fear that Biden would pass an immigration bill.
Mhm.
Right. Now, that would be bad in my view, because that would force me to vote for somebody who I think is manifestly unfit for the office, because I think the Democrats have a very extreme view of immigration in the
But
United
here's the
States.
thing, if there weren't a filibuster,
Mhm.
Obama would have passed the Dream Act with 59 votes.
And you don't think that they would have become more leftist on the issue?
But here's the thing, though. This is why I think it would be good even here, because you agree that if you became too leftist on that, you
Mhm.
would face an incredible backlash, right, on
I hope
immigration.
so. I
Yeah.
hope so. Yeah.
And all you would need is a simple majority and the presidency, right?
Yeah. I think that's fair on
And
this
they'd push
issue.
back on that. And I
Yeah.
think that I just think if you look at some of these policies, like again, like to me, the public option is just a clear one where the Affordable Care Act was it was not terrible legislation, but it was quite bad compared to what it should have been
Mhm.
because you were just afraid of getting filibustered. You couldn't do the things that you should have to make it better policy.
I agree, but don't you think the ideal would be this? The ideal would be you actually do get fucking compromise and debate instead of grandstanding and obstruction. And so
Yes,
you,
I
you
do agree.
actually have the Affordable Care Act, and you do what David Frum argued you should do. Make it a better bill if you're Republicans. Get on board.
Yes.
Clearly, Obama was desperately trying to get a Republican. You should have been the fucking Republican who said, you know what, I'm going to get on board with this, but I want it to be a better bill. Now, the problem, of course, is your voters would have massacred you if you did that.
Yes. Yes.
And so it's just this
But
grandstanding political identity battle
yes.
that
Yes.
really fucks shit up, because as anybody, you listen to people talk, who, especially older people who were in the Congress, and what they will say is, when we were in private, we made all this progress, and then the second it went public, everybody went to their camps and it was over. The committee was done.
Mhm.
So filibuster is not going to do much either way here. Now,
On that, I agree.
right.
No, also, I'm principled on this. So when the filibuster goes against my preferred policies, I'm fine with that. Like
Mhm.
you get a 9-0 Supreme Court that favors conservatives, fine.
Right.
Go, like that's why we have elections. They should matter. And Trump had the Senate and the House, and he's going to obviously appoint conservative justices.
Right. I
You
mean,
know,
my worry though, the one worry that I have, because I do think, like, okay, the filibuster needs a defense intellectually if you're going to claim to be an originalist jurisprudentially, but also support the filibuster as though it's like the essential component to the Congress, and that if you get, or to the Senate, and that if you get rid of it, you're destroying the institution.
Yeah.
Because that's what you get from even people, again, I respect these people, but like Charles Cook at the National Review, who's an adamant originalist, but also acts as though if you get rid of the filibuster, you'd be burning down the Senate. I think if you reversed the issue and you just made it so the filibuster generally helped Democrats, because I do think it's true that the filibuster generally helps Republicans. And that's why they like it, not because of some sort of attachment to the institution, right?
Yes, I agree
And
with
so I
that.
think it
Yes.
makes people intellectually, if not intellectually dishonest, at least hold positions that don't seem coherent with each other.
Now, do you think that perception that it helps Republicans is accurate?
Yes, I do. I think it's
But it
accurate.
doesn't. It helps more conservative, evangelical, and libertarian Republicans.
Yes.
As Klein notes,
Yes.
the ethno-traditionalist Republican policy positions, I think, would be helped without it.
Yeah, and if you had a responsible, thoughtful ethno-traditionalist coalition, they might get rid of the filibuster because they would have active policies that they're pursuing. The problem is,
Right.
you don't yet have that coalition, so you mostly have an obstructionist coalition. An obstructionist because they don't want as much intervention in the economy, and that's perfectly legitimate, right?
But you have to make that argument and win at the ballot there. And
Yes.
I don't understand the justification for blocking minimum wage legislation when it's extremely popular, and when you have a Democratic president who ran on that, and you have a Democratic Senate, and you have a Democratic House. What's the justification for saying, yeah, you have all of the branches of government?
I agree.
You have the votes. This is popular, but fuck you.
That's where I agree. And I'm saying that if you're going to make the case for the filibuster, you have to make a better argument than I've heard or that I could find on. I looked for better arguments for it, and I was very disappointed because
one argument that I saw was it stops bad policy from getting passed. And
But
my counter is, that's what happens when you live in a democratic society. Bad policies get passed all the fucking time.
And on top of that, you can't even make the argument that the founders intended the country to be anti-majoritarian because they didn't create the filibuster. So it wasn't a tool in their kit to prevent that.
And I think it is telling that the one area that conservative evangelicals and more traditional conservatives care about the most, namely judges and Supreme Court nominees, they don't have the.
Well, they nuked it. To be fair, Harry Reid.
Oh no, I'm not getting. I'm just saying that's an area where there's a positive policy position that Republicans have, and they really care about getting conservative justices. And the filibuster is gone, and it has benefited them, and I'm sure they're quite happy about that.
Yeah, they nuked it and got 3 Supreme Court justices out of it.
Yep.
So I'm sure that if it were 2017 and they had a positive legislative vision that was as important to them and as unifying, importantly, because the thing with judges is everybody on the right agrees.
Good time. Yeah.
Yeah. So if they had some sort of legislative thing that they cared about that much that everybody agreed with, they would have nuked the filibuster.
Yes.
They didn't because they don't. I agree. There's no higher principle there.
I also like the argument that when you're playing with live ammunition, you behave differently. So that would maybe
I do too.
Arguably, that would have the effect of hindering performative populism somewhat, because you can't go out and demagogue about how you're going to, hurt big tech or, pass some draconian law about abortion, because now your voters actually, if you only need, 51 votes, voters really expect you to do that. What are you going to do?
Yeah, right? But I think you still can. And most of the time when you do that kind of performance, what you do is you have other people who don't vote for it. So for example, with the certifying the vote,
Yeah,
the people like Hawley and Cruz who voted against it did so knowing that other senators would vote for it and that their
correct.
vote would end up just being this symbolic display.
Yeah,
So you're still going to have a lot of that
you will. Yeah,
performance bullshit.
yes, I 100% agree. I mean, we're not getting rid of that for myriad reasons, but it would at least, I think, mitigate some of the work, especially, the House, you're going to get that. But from senators, I think it would lead to more responsible rhetoric, slightly more, right?
Yes, I think if I mean this is sort of tangential, although it's related to the filibuster, but really, as far as I can tell, any kind of solution to these kinds of problems is going to have to require some kind of, or it will require some kind of more state level attachment and experimentation, political attachment and experimentation. And so I think David French, who's written about this in Divided We Fall, is correct about that. It would take some of the pressure off of the national politics, and people in Wyoming, if you want to have your lifestyle, you by and large you can. And like, because what we do now is, instead of being like, look, in North Dakota, I'm Kristen Noem. I support this kind of a lifestyle or whatever.
She's South
Dakota, excuse me. You still make it national instead of local, instead of the state. And then you can say, look, in my state, things are going about the way I like them. Cool. Right?
I agree with that. I think one problem there, and we touched on this last time, but it's still worth noting, is that a lot of the problem that occurs does so because all of these businesses and corporations require highly educated workers, and you still have a highly nationalized media, and social media is not limited to your locality.
No, social
Therefore,
media.
even if the federal government said we're just not going to do anything with the states, you do whatever you want, South Dakota is still going to become more woke, right? Their values will shift. There's nothing you can do about that.
One of the great evils, this is completely tangential to filibuster now, but it's worth noting before closing out. One of the great evils of social media is that it allows you to see what's happening everywhere in the United States in a second.
And become extremely passionate about what's happening.
Right, because you think about this, in 1860, if something happened somewhere, you had no fucking clue about it for a long time. Now, and even in 1950, it's like if it didn't make it onto the news or into a newspaper, you didn't really know about it. Now, it could be the most trivial incident. It could be one white nationalist asshole in Wyoming does something dumb, and that gets retweeted by every progressive on Twitter as an indication of the problem in the United States.
Yeah,
and the same for the woke. One woke asshole does something in New York City, and that's tweeted by everybody, and they're like, look at these woke crazies.
Right. And it takes an outsized importance. So it's more important that this one woke person said ridiculous bullshit on, like MSNBC or whatever, than that Biden expanded SNAP benefits and made a special period
or
where
what
you
are
can get
the
health
details
insurance.
in the, like I see this with, it's just fascinating. You look at, like, when you care about policies like immigration policy, and so I read hours a day on immigration policy, and I don't see people fucking talking about shit on all the anti-woke people. They're not talking about the real policies. What's the best enforcement? What's the Biden freeze going to do, et cetera, et cetera. It's all just like pointing out individual idiot wokesters and making fun of them. And we have to accept that that's always going to be more appealing to humans because it's basically like gossip. And we're programmed for individual level, programmed in scare quotes, for individual level gossip and tidbits, right? So we do a lot of that, but it distracts from the actual policies. And the problem is when you have social media drawing so much attention to those things and not filtering them out, which is what the media used to do, is actually importantly, the media filtered out a lot of noise.
That's right.
Right. And now you're not filtering out that noise. And in fact, some of the most prominent figures on Twitter are people who just go to places and get their ass kicked on purpose to show you about the devilish perfidy of some group or another.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, that's not a way to it's not a way to facilitate compromise and reasonable policy making.
No, agreed.
All of that, of course, outside of the filibuster.
But it's also, I mean, same thing that like civic organizations and unions, they have the,
Yes.
you know, disciplining individuals,
Right.
and making sure that you're attending to longer term group
Right.
interests.
Right, because these are people, like when you get these immigration groups that actually care about the policies, or unions, they're like, fuck you, we don't care about that. Focus on the policy. You have to like, don't go online and spout off about one immigrant who murdered somebody here and make a big deal out of it. We look at the long run. We need to focus on actually accomplishing what we want to accomplish. And in many ways, and this is what I disdain about people like Hawley, is they do these performances that actually undermine their ability to pass the policies they claim to want, because they're so alienating. It's like Matt Gaetz and Jim Jordan and these people, they just alienate everybody. And so you actually can't pass the policies that you should want to pass because nobody fucking likes you and nobody's going to work with you.
Yeah. And so I don't think by no means is getting rid of the filibuster going to solve all of these problems, but to the extent that it promotes a more of a care for concrete policies because you know that you can pass these, I think that's a good thing. Get legislators working on thinking more about how do we get this vaccine from point A to point D, then I'm going to go on Twitter and talk about the economic oligarchs who are suppressing your free speech, but I'm not going to do a goddamn thing about it.
Right. So I think to the extent that the filibuster, again, my position is I'm agnostic about it, but if you're going to defend it, you really need more intellectual heft than I've seen. And I do think perhaps the single biggest problem we face is this problem of the performance, the outsized influence of performance and the incredibly shrinking influence of actual policy making. And I think a lot of people who are responsible adults, the people like Jeff Flake, Ben Sass, Rob Portman, who's retiring, they see this and they know it and they fucking hate it, but there's nothing right now, there's just nothing you can do about it.
That's right. And, you know, again, like we even saw this just today discussing the transgender ban. That's just Trumpian performative populism. Yeah. Not thought out at all, not implemented competently, right?
Right. It's a thing where even when there might be some underlying issue you could talk about, nobody actually talks about that underlying issue in a serious way. Right. Same thing with immigration. I mean, there was some construction of walls, the beautiful border wall, that I was in favor of. The problem is, by turning it into this grotesque rhetorical point, you made it so toxic to people that you actually weren't talking about or facilitating the policy that you should have wanted. More border security. You just turned it into this stupid metaphor that alienated people. And then Biden, of course, stopped border construction immediately on the quote unquote wall, because at that point it was this symbolic issue.
That's right. And also, I mean, if you didn't have the filibuster, the Trump administration would have been able to pass legislation on immigration.
Yeah, I don't know if they actually would have.
Well, if you had a competent president,
right,
that was a Republican.
Well, this is where you need, I hesitate to use the term ethno-traditionalist because I don't think people know what that means and they associate it with ethno-nationalism. But you need a coalition of conservatives who care about getting policies through, who will drop the performance a little bit. I mean, you're always going to perform a bit, it's politics, but let's settle down on the performance and focus on an actual legislative agenda.
Yeah, and you know, to the extent that you don't have one because you're just giving people salient culture war bullshit, ideally you should lose elections, right? That would be
Yeah, and
my goal. It's like, if you're not going to
right.
pass anything, just get out, man.
I
We'll
think the
vote you out of
problem
office.
is you have like Mitch McConnell is perfectly happy to watch Hawley and others do this performance bullshit so long as they can unify on judges and a few other things, because that's what
right.
he cares about. In
Yeah,
fact, he's probably not interested in the coalition that I'm interested in creating on the right.
no, he's almost certainly not. So
Right.
yes, he's perfectly content with the status quo, and his legacy will be the 3 Supreme Court justices. Right.
I thought that he could have a moment of heroism and vote for impeachment against Trump.
well, that
but
didn't
I don't
happen.
think that's going to happen.
All right, so that'll basically we'll do a wrap there, and we'll be back next week. I'm sure that we'll be talking about more performative populism, and
Indeed.
Trump will undoubtedly be in the news.